I remember that metallic clang echoing down the block like it was yesterday. It was a crisp Monday morning, the kind where you expect nothing more than the mail truck or the garbage crew, but instead there was this flatbed stacked with heavy tools and a gleaming hydraulic excavator that looked far too serious for a suburban cul-de-sac. I stood there barefoot in my driveway, steam rising from my coffee mug, watching these workers uncoil bright orange safety tape like they were prepping a crime scene. And across the street, Mrs. Gable paused mid-sprinkle over her hydrangeas, her face all scrunched up in that classic "What on earth is going on?" Look we all get when the peace is disturbed. We weren't the kind of neighborhood where things happen without a 3-week notice in the mail. But lately, the air around Silver Oaks had started to feel a little different, a little tighter. That's when I saw them. Two guys in reflective vests walking toward the fire hydrant at the corner of Willow and Juniper. Our hydrant, the one painted a stubborn cherry red with a silver cap worn smooth by decades of summer storms and kids leaning their bikes against it. I'd jogged past that thing for 15 years. I'd hooked my dog's leash to it 1,000 times while chatting with neighbors, and I knew its silhouette better than I knew my own mailbox. So I stepped forward, call it instinct or just being a nosy retiree, and I asked, "Hey fellas, what's the deal with the red giant?" And one of them, a younger kid with a clipboard and a nasty sunburn, didn't oppose to even look up as he muttered, "Work order. HOA's removing it. Something about landscape uniformity." I felt my heart do a weird little skip because, landscape uniformity, and, fire safety, Don and oppose. T usually sit at the same table. And as the other guy started unbolting the side cap with a massive wrench, I realized my voice was getting louder, attracting Mrs. Gable's attention. I told them they couldn't and oppose. T just yank out public infrastructure, that there was state code, there was liability, there was common sense, but the kid just shrugged and said, "Talk to the board, man, we just do what's on the paper." By noon, the red giant was gone, and in its place stood a square of fresh mulch, a spindly little ornamental bush, and a brass plaque that read Community Beautification, Phase 1. And I could feel my jaw tightening so hard it hurt. It wasn't an oppose. Too long before our HOA president, a woman named Regina Vance, who always smelled like expensive lily of the valley and spoke in a voice that was one syllable short of a direct insult, came strutting by in her linen blazer and those wedge sandals that click-clacked on the asphalt like a countdown timer. She had this entourage of clipboard-clutching volunteers trailing her, and when she saw me, she gave me this prim, rehearsed smile and said, "Good afternoon, Mr. Garrison. I trust you're enjoying the new curb aesthetics," And I just stared at her and asked if she'd lost her mind removing a hydrant. She tilted her head like I was a toddler rambling about monsters under the bed and said, "We're updating the visual profile of Silver Oaks, Arthur. The city signed off, and besides, you're retired now, aren't you? Maybe let the current generation handle the heavy lifting." Something in me cracked right then, because I wasn't just some grumpy old man shouting at clouds. I was a former battalion chief with 30 years of service, 2 unit citations, and the kind of burn scars on my shoulder that tell stories about what happens when people treat fire safety like a nuisance. I knew what it looked like when a structure fire met a neighborhood with no pressurized water, and I tried to tell her they weren't and oppose. Tea decorations, that they save lives, but she was already walking away, her heels clicking a rhythmic "I'm not listening" all the way down the street. That evening, I went into the HOA's online portal, digging through the meeting minutes, and let me tell you, nowhere did it say, "remove life-saving equipment," It was all buried in legalese about, hardscape revisions, and, visual upgrades, cloaked in design jargon meant to bore anyone into submission. So I started my own file. I took photos of the empty mulch patches. I pulled up the emergency response maps I'd kept from my station days, and I even called my old captain to confirm that removing hydrants without a replacement plan was a direct violation of the 2018 Safety Maintenance Ordinance. I didn't oppose. T want to go to war. I really didn't oppose. I wanted to believe it was just a lapse in judgment, maybe some bad advice from a high-priced landscaping consultant who didn't oppose. T know the difference between a petunia and a standpipe, but then the next day, the hydrant 2 blocks over vanished. And the day after that, The one on Larkspur Lane was gone, replaced by a decorative stone fountain that sprayed a fine mist over a bench labeled, in quote, the relaxation zone, in quote. And I felt this cold weight in my chest, the kind of dread you get when you know something's going to burn and you're the only one watching the match get lit. By the end of the week, every fire hydrant on the north side of Silver Oaks was gone, mulched over, hidden behind trellises, or replaced by granite sculptures of leaves. And the HOA newsletter arrived with a beaming photo of Regina cutting a ribbon in front of the new, in quote, reflection garden, in quote, which sat right on top of the old emergency sprinkler hookup. Most of the neighborhood didn't oppose to even notice, or worse, they didn't oppose to care. They were too busy admiring the new, in quote, cohesion, in quote. But I couldn't oppose to sit still, so I called Chief Miller at Station 42, a man who chewed spearmint gum like it was his only lifeline and had a voice like gravel dipped in honey. I told him what was happening, and the silence on the other end was so heavy I thought the line had gone dead before he cursed under his breath and asked, in quote, "Are you kidding me, Garrison? That's a damn lawsuit waiting to happen. Send me everything you've got?" End quote. I spent the next 6 hours putting together a dossier, photos, map overlays with red radiuses showing the massive gaps in coverage and highlighted sections of the state code. And I sent it off thinking the cavalry was coming. But a few days later, instead of a fire marshal, I got a knock on my door from a guy named Kevin, the HOA's, in quote, compliance officer, in quote, who wore his logo-branded polo like body armor and handed me a white envelope without even saying hello. It was a notice of non-compliance, a $1,500 fine for, in quote, undermining community trust, in quote, by filing an external complaint without seeking, in quote, internal resolution, end quote, and they'd already deactivated my key fob for the gym and the pool. I told Kevin to tell Regina that when someone's house goes up because she wanted better curb appeal, the blood would be on her hands, but he just stared at me with those flat, rehearsed eyes and walked away. The next HOA newsletter had a full-page article written by Regina herself titled, in quote, outdated infrastructure and modern elegance, why fire hydrants are a thing of the past, end quote, where she actually cited some fringe study from 15 years ago about interior sprinklers to justify her, in quote, vision, end quote. I was losing my mind, but then I met Sarah, an elderly woman who'd lived here since the 80s and walked with a cane, but had a stare that could melt lead, and she found me staring at a granite leaf sculpture where a hydrant used to be. She told me a hydrant out front had saved her house back in '94, and she asked if I was the fireman making all that noise. When I nodded, she offered to write a letter, and for the first time I didn't oppose. T feel like I was screaming into a vacuum. We were just a couple of, in quote, obsolete, in quote, residents, a retiree, and a lady with a cane, but we started a real paper trail, sending copies of the HOA's own newsletters to the county emergency services and leaving voicemails for the local news. The HOA tried to bury my posts on the community forum, citing, in quote, harmony, in quote, but every time they took one down, I'd see a few more likes, a few more private messages from neighbors who were starting to wake up and realize their safety had been traded for a flower bed. Then came the centerpiece of Regina's reign, the new Silver Oaks Grand Clubhouse, a 2-story monument of polished stone, floor-to-ceiling glass, and modern wood slats that cost a fortune and looked like something out of a tech billionaire's fever dream. It had a rooftop garden, a massive cedar-burning fireplace, and a, in quote, smart water system, in quote, that was supposed to be the height of eco-innovation. And at the grand opening, there was a live quartet playing string versions of pop songs and plastic flutes of cheap champagne. I stood across the street in my old work boots, watching the board members congratulate themselves like they'd just brokered world peace. And I looked for the hydrants, not one near the driveway, none near the east lawn, nothing but, in quote, relaxation zones, in quote, and mulch. I wandered around the back, away from the music, and found a pile of soil behind a utility shed where I saw it. The base plate of the hydrant from my corner, hawthorn and willow, bent, rusted, and dumped like common trash and weeds. I knelt down and touched the dent where a kid had hit it with a scooter years ago, and I realized right then that these people didn't oppose. T just lacked judgment. They lacked a soul. They'd build a palace on a hollow promise of safety. Kevin found me back there and told me I was trespassing on private property, that I was, in quote, suspended, in quote, but I just looked him in the eye and said, and quote, "Fire doesn't in Oppos. T care about your suspension, Kevin. This place is a tinderbox," and quote. And as I walked away, I saw Sarah and a few others watching from the curb, their faces pale in the glow of the clubhouse lights. The fire started at exactly 1:42 in the morning. I know because I saw the orange flicker through my bedroom blinds, and my old radio scanner, which I still kept on my nightstand, exploded with chatter about and quote, "Structure fire, fully involved," and quote. I didn't in Oppos. To even put on shoes, I just grabbed my flashlight and ran, and when I crested the hill, the sky was pulsing with a violent, beautiful amber that made my stomach drop, because I knew that color meant the roof was already gone. People were spilling out of their houses in pajamas, phones held up to film the destruction, and there was Regina, standing in a silk robe and heels, actual heels, screaming in her phone that the fire department was taking too long. I heard her shout and quote, "What do you mean you can in Oppos? T find a hookup? Use the smart water system," and quote. And I almost wanted to laugh at the sheer, desperate ignorance of it if the heat hadn't into Oppos. T been slamming into my face like a physical wall. The clubhouse was roaring, the end quote, eco glass and quote, shattering into a million diamonds on the pavement. And then I saw a silhouette in the second floor window. It was Marcus, the night security guard who was only 19 and probably terrified out of his mind. I didn't in Oppos. T think. I just moved. Years of muscle memory taking over as I wrapped my shirt around my face and charged into the lobby, which was already a swirling vortex of black smoke and melting plastic. I found him huddled in the break room, coughing so hard he couldn't into Oppos. T stand, and I hoisted him over my shoulder, feeling the heat searing the hair on my arms as the ceiling groaned above us. We made it out just as the southern wall gave way with a shriek of twisting steel, sending a plume of embers into the night sky like a sick firework finale. And I laid Marcus on the grass as the first engine from Station 42 finally rolled onto the scene. But they didn't in Oppos. T stop. They kept rolling, their lights bouncing off the houses because they couldn't into Oppos. T find a single damn place to plug in. I ran to the captain, a guy I'd mentored 10 years ago, and he just looked at me with his hollow expression and said, and quote, "Garrison, there's nothing here. We're having to lay a line from the main road half a mile away. We're losing it." End quote. The crowd watched in a horrifying, stunned silence as the firefighters stood there with empty hoses, waiting for the water to travel the long distance, while the pride of Silver Oaks turned into a steaming skeleton of charred beams and broken dreams. By the time the water finally hit the flames, it was an autopsy, not a rescue. The building was gone, and Regina was sitting on the curb with her mascara running down her face, staring at the ruin like it had personally betrayed her. The next few days were a blur of yellow tape, news vans, and county investigators who didn't in Oppos. T care about in quote, curb appeal in quote, or in quote, community harmony in quote. They cared about why 5 hydrants had been decommissioned without a permit. The lead investigator, a sharp woman named Detective Vance, no relation to Regina, thank God, spent 4 hours in my garage looking through my dossier, my photos, and my copies of the HOA warnings. She told me I'd basically done her job for her, and when the local news ran the story with the headline in quote, "Luxury clubhouse burns while hydrants sit in landfill," end quote, the entire neighborhood turned into a powder keg of its own. We had a town hall meeting a week later, but it wasn't in Oppos. T held in a fancy room. It was in the park under the streetlights, and Regina tried to give a speech about, in quote, moving forward together, in quote, but the residents weren't into Oppos. T having it. Sarah stood up, leaning heavy on her cane, and asked Regina how much a life was worth compared to a flower bed, and the silence that followed was the loudest thing I've ever heard. The lawsuits started falling like rain. The insurance company refused to pay out because the fire safety violations had voided the policy, and suddenly the, in quote, beautification fund, in quote, was being emptied to pay for legal defense and massive county fines. The board resigned in a single, panicked wave. One of them actually moved out in the middle of the night, and an interim council was formed, not of, in quote, visionaries, in quote, but of people who actually cared if their neighbors lived or died. They asked me to head the safety committee, and the first thing we did was and Oppos. T planting trees, or picking out stone leaf sculptures. It was hiring a crew to dig up the mulch and the bushes. I stood on that corner, hawthorn and willow, and watched as they bolted a brand new, gleaming red hydrant onto the pipe. And when they flushed the line and that clear, pressurized water came geysering out into the street, I felt a weight lift off my chest that I didn't in Oppos to even know I was carrying. It wasn't an Oppos T about winning. It wasn't Oppos T about being right. It was about the fact that the next time a light flickers or a wire shorts, the people in this neighborhood have a fighting chance. But, I look around now, and the clubhouse site is still just a blackened hole in the ground because we donned Oppos to have the money to rebuild it yet. And honestly, maybe that's for the best. It's a reminder that beauty without a foundation of safety is just an expensive way to watch things burn. And I wonder if other neighborhoods out there are trading their, red giants, for a little bit of, uniformity, What do you think? Is it worth the risk for a better view? Or should we start paying a lot more attention to what's being buried under our mulch? Let me know in the comments. I really want to hear if your HOA is playing with fire too.